Hi there, boys and girls. Today for story time, let's read Mr. Nonsense by Roger Hargreaves. Mr. Nonsense had no sense at all, not a scrap. I mean, he lived in a tree. A tree! Can you imagine? Why do you live in a tree? Mr. Happy asked him one day. Because, replied Mr. Nonsense, I tried living on the ground, but that was too high up, so I moved up a tree to be nearer the ground. What nonsense, snorted Mr. Happy. Thank you, replied Mr. Nonsense. And do you know what Mr. Nonsense liked to eat? Oatmeal. Nothing wrong with that, you might say, but oatmeal on toast? Really? Why do you like oatmeal on toast? Mr. Nosey asked him one day. Because, replied Mr. Nonsense, I tried oatmeal sandwiches, but I didn't like them. And do you know where Mr. Nonsense sleeps every night? In a rowboat, in his bedroom, in his house, up a tree. A rowboat to sleep in? Interesting. Why do you sleep in a rowboat? Mr. Strong asked him one day. Because, replied Mr. Nonsense, I tried sleeping in a motorboat, but it was somewhat uncomfortable. Mr. Nonsense lives, as you might very well expect, in a country called Nonsense Land. Now, I know somebody else who lives in Nonsense Land. Do you? That's right. Mr. Silly. Mr. Silly and Mr. Nonsense were close friends and saw a lot of each other. Mr. Nonsense was often at Mr. Silly's house, playing with jigsaw puzzles. They used to throw the pieces at each other. How silly. And Mr. Silly was often at Mr. Nonsense's house, playing cards. They used to tear them up to see who could get the most pieces out of one card. What nonsense. However, this story is about the time it snowed in Nonsense Land. It didn't very often snow, but one winter it did. Now, tell me, what color is snow? No, in Nonsense Land when it snows, it doesn't snow white snow. It snows yellow snow. Don't ask me why, but it does. Yellow snow. Don't eat the yellow snow. And when Mr. Silly woke up one morning, the whole of Nonsense Land was covered. I say, he said when he looked out of his bedroom window, snow! And he was so excited he rushed to Mr. Nonsense's house. Mr. Nonsense was asleep, in his boat. Wake up, cried Mr. Silly, wake up, and come and look out the window. Whatever on earth is it? Grumbled Mr. Nonsense, rubbing the sleep out of his eyes as he got up and went to his bedroom window. I say, he said, looking out, custard. That isn't custard, you silly banana, cried Mr. Silly. That's snow. He rushed downstairs. Come on, he called. And that day Mr. Silly and Mr. Nonsense had one of the very best days of their lives. They had a snowball fight. Mr. Silly's snowballs were round. They're a sphere shape, round like a circle, like a ball. Mr. Nonsense made snowballs that somehow or the other came out sort of square, like a cube. They built a snowman, a very nonsensical sort of snowman. Come on, said Mr. Nonsense that afternoon. Let's go tobogganing. But we don't have a toboggan, said Mr. Silly. Oh, no, we don't, agreed Mr. Nonsense. Mr. Silly thought. Oh, yes, we do, he cried. And Mr. Silly ran back to Mr. Nonsense house and came back with his bed. "Whee!" they shouted together as they slid faster and faster down the hill in the rowboat toboggan. It was a wonderful day. The end. Mr. Nonsense. I hope you enjoyed the story. A very silly, nonsensical story. See you next time. Bye-bye.